Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video I want to follow on from our last SEraphon one by looking at another recipe for skin that might be cool for some of the characters, and particularly how I would go about painting the mounts if I was going to do an army of these lizards. I'll go through the recipes and processes, but also my reasoning for choosing those particular colours and whatnot. And hopefully between the two videos you'll be able to get started on an awesome looking gaming army for your Lizardmen. Now let's paint. As you'll have seen from the thumbnail, the scheme I've gone for the Scarvet on top of the Aggradon is a sort of albino one, and very much with this I find it's an easier place if we have a light starting point. So I've gone for a grey primer and then I'm airbrushing on the Wraithbone paint from Games Workshop. I could have just rattle canned him with the Wraithbone primer, but I can't find it since I did the last Lizardman video, so I've just airbrushed it on. It gives us the same starting point. And much like before, over that coat of Wraithbone, we're going to airbrush just the first layer of contrast paint. Now, it doesn't act like contrast paint when we put it through the airbrush, but it gives us a little, I think, a nicer place to work from. I think the paint adheres better. I just think it looks nicer. And the starting point I'm going for is a 50-50 mix of MAgos Purple and Dreadful Visage. And I've thinned this with a little bit of airbrush thinner in my airbrush. I'm spraying about 25 psi using a 0.4mm needle and nozzle. And this is our signature series, Harder and Steenbeck Infinity. If you haven't got the airbrush, don't worry, doesn't matter, just brush paint it on. And the first brush coat that I'm going to put on it is exactly the same mix. In fact, I just dipped my brush into the pot of the airbrush because there was still some in there. And I'm going to paint this over the scales. Now, I wanted to go for albino, and I looked at a lot of pictures of albino lizards, albino reptiles, and I was a bit worried it might end up being a bit pink. And then another part of me was like, well, it doesn't matter, like pink's cool too. But there's these things called leopard geckos, and when they're albino, they've still got a little bit of their sort of other coloured markings in them, which are cool. So that gave me an idea with where I could possibly go with this guy. And you see in these two clips, I've just been applying that mix repeatedly over the scales, and each time focusing it either towards the spine or towards the centre of the area of those scales, just so we get this lovely transition of the light, really almost just off white, through to this darker pinky grey colour. And the reason I put the Dreadful Visage in there is because it's this sort of grey purple, so it will darken the pink down, but it will also desaturate it a bit, so hopefully take us away from it looking too pink. So I guess I've probably got 4 or 5 layers on there by this point on the scales. Now I've gone in with the pure MAgos Purple. Now these are on my palette, and I've got a big blob of the contrast medium that I'm constantly thinning them with. I'm not putting them on neat by any means, and this one's very, very heavily thinned, and I'm just wanting to go in the sort of the knuckles, the creases between the toes, areas like that where I just want to add a little bit more of that sort of pinky flesh to him. Now for the spines, I'm giving a base coat of reddish grey by AK. This is because I kind of want them to be pretty dark, and if I tried to get there with contrast paint on its own, it'd take forever and you get that weird blotchy finish. So I found a colour I liked that was a normal acrylic paint. I'm just applying that here. One thing I really enjoyed with the previous Lizardman video, and I really did, and the response was wonderful and so lovely at Whammerfest. People come up and talk about it. It's got me proper pumped, I'm not going to lie. I'd never painted lizards before that either, so it's a really fun one to do. But one thing it's forcing me to do, particularly this style that we're using, is to be accurate. And that's going to have a knock-on effect for the rest of my painting, which is great. It's just nice to paint in a different way. And then over the top of that grey, I'm just giving it a coat of the Dreadful Visage just to blend it together a bit. Now, like I said about those leopard geckos still having some of their sort of coloured markings on them, admittedly they're sort of orange and pink, those ones, but if I was painting a lizard's army, I think I'd be going with green as my dominant colour. So I was like, oh, how would I tie this albino dude into the rest of it? So I've taken Creed Camo, which is this nice dark green contrast paint, and that's what I would use for the spine colour if I was going to do some Saurus. And I'm just doing little dots along the spine area to sort of give him a mottled effect. And the reason I've used contrast for this is because of that little bit of pooling it does when you touch it on there. And what that means is it just sort of dissipates out slightly, and I think gives a nice sort of irregular, sort of freckled look without too much work. The key here really is just not to have too much on the brush and just to be ever so gentle when you're dotting it onto the model. And most of the dots you're going to need to go over 2 or 3 times, but you know, it's a couple of minutes if that to do it. I wouldn't be doing this on all the Saurus by any means, but I think on the leader, I think it's pretty cool. And then once they're on there, just going to glaze over them again with that dreadful visage, just to help tie them into the scales underneath and just further darken that spine of the character. And much like the previous Saurus video, for the majority of this, I'm just using that lovely great big brush. And you can see I've mixed in a tiny bit of that Creed camo into the dreadful visage, just to give it that slight green tint as well. For the face parts, I've just gone in with a MAgos Purple again on its own. I've made sure to leave the face area clean, so I could just go in and do a bunch of this. Things like the teeth, the tongue, the cordage, all that sort of thing, I'm doing exactly the same way as I did on the previous video. Now all I've done here is I was finding it quite hard to look at the model because it was also white, so I've just gone in and quickly blacked out the areas of armour just to make it easier for me to read the model. That's the only purpose for that. It just helped me see if there's any areas I'd missed, and there were a few that I completely missed, just because it was all so white, so close to it. And then one thing I like to do over the contrast is just go in and give a little bit of an edge highlight here and there, sort of in the focal areas, so around the face, around the head. And all I've done is taken an off-white colour, in this case Vallejo model colour Ivory, but any sort of off-white will do, and I'm mixing in the various contrast paints that I've used on different stages. So for instance, I'll have mixed in a tiny bit of MAgos Purple here to do the edge highlighting around the lightest scales. Then I might mix in a little bit of the brown, or reddish grey rather, to highlight those spines. But I say everything else on him I've just done exactly the same as the other Saurus video. Now quite a few of you have asked about the how would I paint mounts and how would I go about it. For me, if I was going to do an army, I'd want my lizards to be really colourful, and then I'd try and have my mounts be much more dull, much less interesting from a point of sort of brightness and saturation point of view. So to that end, I've base coated him in brown grey, very boring colour. I basically want to make him red. If my lizards are going to be green, I've decided I'm going to go red. It's a nice contrast, and we know it works. If we look at the colour wheel, it's a really obvious one, and people say, oh, red and green looks Christmassy. I think you're fine. So all I'm going to do is play with different tones of green and different tones of red. And for the reds, as it were, on this, I'm going to go very, very desaturated. So we've chosen brown grey as the base. Then I'm airbrushing on dark rust here, so sort of an orange colour, orange-brown. I am using the airbrush because it's a much larger surface now we've got with the mounts. And the airbrush I find is just going to make it easier. If you haven't got one, doesn't matter, just follow the exact same process as you've done with your lizards. Also wanted to say huge thank you to those of you that support us over on Patreon. We hit a massive milestone this month. You're all incredible. Me and Andy are so appreciative of the support. It just makes us want to create more and more content for you. So you're getting content here, you're getting content over on Patreon. We've got the other channel going now as well, the podcast, and it's all because of the support you're all giving us. So thank you ever so much. Likes and subscribes really help on here too, though. So, cheers for them too. And then to darken up the spine, I've taken Hull Red, which is a dark red colour, dark red brown, and say I'm just aiming towards the centre of the spine. So exactly the same approach as I've done on the lizards, that light belly. I can't think what the name for that is now. Something. I've done quite a lot of reading on reptiles because of these videos. It's been quite good fun. But there's something to do with animals that have a lighter coloured belly, and then it gets darker. But anyway, so yeah, light, darker, and then darkest along the spine. But quite dull, which is exactly what I'm after. So we'll get that nice colour contrast, but we'll also get that contrast between a really vibrant, saturated green lizard and the desaturated mount. I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting, and I want to bring greens in wherever possible in my army. So I would bring in lots of different tones of green. So I've got Incubi Darkness here, which is sort of dark turquoise colour. And I'm going to start airbrushing this on to the extremities. So I'm going to do his little claws and his feet. And I love doing this. I did this on a Mybrute Troggoth a year or two ago. Might be longer than that now, when the last edition of AOS came out. And I really loved the effect. I did it on the Hobgrots as well, and I've been waiting for something else to do it on. And this just seemed like a good idea. There's so many amazing sort of colour plates, for want of a better term, you can go and look at for dinosaurs, for reptiles, for birds, just so many cool ideas for markings they're doing on them. And then I wanted to use that Incubi Darkness right down the spine as well, so nice and tight. This is just airbrush control really, there's no trick to it. I haven't changed my settings at all. I've thinned the Incubi Darkness probably slightly more thinner than paint. I'm still spraying at 25 psi. You know, there's no trick to it. There's no magic recipe or anything. It's just sort of a bit of airbrush control. But say this is a nice big needle, and nozzle is to 0.4, and I'm able to be as accurate as I need to be, and that's just going to come through a bit of practice. So if you're nervous about doing it, just do it with a brush. Be absolutely fine. Just take you slightly longer. And there we go. That's all the airbrushing that I want to do on him. But it's just allowed me to get to this stage nice and quickly. And I think he looks awesome. I'm not going to lie. Like, I'm loving painting these lizards. They're amazing. They're just amazing. Now to make it a little bit weirder, and not necessarily markings that I've seen in the oh, you can hear that's my furry lizard in the background. But yeah, just want to paint in some weird little squiggles here with the Incubi Darkness as well. So you can see once they're all completed, I think he's looking pretty cool here, pretty sort of fantastical enough, but also still nice and muted. Now, really important prep for the next stage. We're going to give this a very heavy gloss varnish finish, or gloss finish with a varnish. Really want him looking like a boiled sweet here. So use a rattle can. I use an airbrush, whatever you like to get your gloss varnish on with. Will do the job, but just good and shiny. And we're going to give him a wash using contrast paint, so using Ratling Grime here. Now, you'll often, if you've seen any of the other videos in here, you'll often see me use oils or enamels for this sort of thing. You can also use normal washes or contrast paints like this. The gloss surface is going to make that paint run into the recesses really easily, and it's also going to make it very easy to clean off the raised areas. So all I'm doing here is very gently, just with a wet Q-tip, just wiping that over the surface. It's just going to pick any of that contrast that might be sat where we don't want it. And I'm going to work around the model in sections so I don't get too much of it drying or pooling in one area, so I don't miss it. That is one of the downsides to using the acrylics for this, is that they do dry quicker than the oils, say. But you know, if you take care, consider what you're doing, work in sections, you won't find an issue. And the reason I didn't want to use oils for this is I just didn't want that finish that oils give me, or that effect that oils give me for this. You can see there I'd missed a little bit where the contrast has pooled on the flat area, and this is a few minutes later, and all I've done is taken a Q-tip here, just dipped it in water, touched the excess off, and then very gently just wiping it over the surface, waiting for the paint to reactivate, and then you can remove it. If you rub too hard, you'll go through and you'll wipe the paint off, but that's the only thing that will cause that. So if you're gentle, you're not going to have any issues. Once I was happy with it and it had fully dried, I just gave the whole thing a coat of satin varnish. And I'll probably give it another coat of satin varnish or matte varnish towards the end before I do the metals. But the main reason for doing satin at this point was, one, to see what the finish was like if it was satin, but also it's very hard to paint over the top of gloss. The paint doesn't stick to it very well. So just giving it this satin finish now, just to see where everything's at. And I'm really happy. That extra definition the Ratling Grime has brought in has been great. And you know what? It was quite nice using the acrylic, not having any of the solvents to use. The drying time, as I say, being very quick. So that was pretty cool. Now the highlights, just like I've done on the Rider, just like we did on the Saurus in the video before, I'm using the one colour, so Ivory in this case, and just mixing it in with the paints that we're going over to create the highlight colour. So for the Incubi Darkness, we mix in the Incubi Darkness. For the brown, we mix in the browns, the dark rusts, all of that. It's just a really efficient way of creating those highlight colours and getting them on without having tons of different pots of paint. And to that end, to paint the stone saddle throne thing he was in, I've just taken the black on my palette and then just mixed in the various greys and browns that I have on there already to create different greys. And then as you can see here, we sort of give it a base coat and then lighten it up a little, lots of little scratches, mix in another slightly lighter one, do some more scratches. I just think it gives you a really nice natural looking stone colour. And then because I had some Creed camo on there as well, I've watered that down even further I'm just going to wash that into a few of the areas just to give it that look when you get a bit of the, it's not algae, is it? But you know what I mean, when you get a little bit of that sort of moss type stuff on stone. I think looks really cool. And the celestite bits of the model, so the spear and this little happy chap up here, I'm going to use exactly the same technique, but I'll just use some different colours. So I've got Incubi Darkness here, so again riffing off those greens. There's an awful lot of greens, and you shift into blues as well, don't you, sometimes with them, and I think it's going to provide you with loads of variety over an army without ever really getting sort of bored, without it looking too monotone as well. So yeah, that's my reasoning for using the greens. And then yeah, exactly the same technique, lots of tons of little scratches. So I've mixed in a bit of ivory and then just loads of scratches, and I'll do more of the lighter scratches from a light source, so top left as we look at that, just to reinforce the idea that it's sort of a curved bit of stone. And then the only different thing here is I've got quite a thin wash of Dark Angels Green contrast paint over the top of that, just again to change the tone of it. Feathers. There's a lot of them on the Lizards models. They're an amazing opportunity to get some ridiculous colours onto the model, and particularly when I've got something like this dull Aggradon, we can use these few little spot areas of super bright colours. And again, contrast paints are your friend here. You can create some very, very simple blends which work particularly well on these small areas like these smaller feathers. So we brush on the yellow contrast. Now these are the newer range of contrast paints. They're a lot more powerful than the original range. They're a lot more like inks, so they're great for this sort of colours and jobs that we're doing here. And basically I'm working through yellow, through green, through a darker green into a turquoise, and you can see each time I'm just painting them on slightly further down each feather, generally pulling from the lighter area towards the darker area. And if you get any areas of those transitions that look a little shonky, go back to the previous colour, thin it down, and just repeat the process, and you'll very, very quickly get a lovely blend through into the colours. It's blending via glazing. It's something you'll see us do in most of our videos. But again, here I am just edge highlighting over the top of it, putting a few dashes in to represent the little feathers on there. I think this kind of thing really benefits contrast paints. I think it takes them up to that next level of you haven't just slopped the contrast paint over, which is kind of what we're wanting to do, right? Take it up a little notch so that when people are looking at these armies, they're really impressed on the table. But when they pick them up and look at each individual model, they can see that, the care that we've taken and how cool they kind of look. And there we go. That was it. As I say, everything else is covered in the other Saurus video. So the base I will link up in the top now. It's from a previous SEraphon video, and the metals and the rope and all that, I say, are in that previous Saurus video. I kind of went all in on the gold on this guy. I was like, he already looks pretty ridiculous. It's this pink lizard riding a dinosaur. Why not? Why? Let's pretend the skinks have dressed him all in gold because he's some badass lizard king. And I really like how he's come out. I kind of wish I had a green Saurus to pop on top to see how that would work. So if I wanted to do more Aggradons, I guess I could do this other box of Aggradons here. It's worth saying Games Workshop did send us this model and the Aggradons. So yeah, maybe if you'd like to see that, let me know. My hope is that with this and the last video, it's going to give you a ton of starting points with getting going on your lizards. My hope also is that we get a Vanguard box, which if we look historically seems to have been often what the army launch boxes were, with maybe one or two little tweaks. So I'm hoping a ton of skinks and a frog and maybe a monster. So my hope is when that comes out, we can do that as a series on here, and I can add it in to the Saurus stuff, and by then we'll have the full range of the lizard models to see how we can do them. But in the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope if you've picked any of these SEraphon models up, you're going to enjoy painting them. I know I certainly have. It's been so different to what I normally paint. I'm gushing about them a bit really, but I haven't had a range like this for a long time where it's been something completely new to me. And I've enjoyed painting it quite so much. And the two things I would say I've enjoyed the most is approaching it in this different way, so starting very light and then working the colours down, largely using contrast paints, but also having to be accurate. There's no, I can just weather that out, I can create a scratch, I can create a bit of battle damage or whatever, that'll be great, it'd be fine. If I get metal or brown or something on that albino skin, I'm going to have to go right back and redo that whole area of the skin, which sucks. So it's definitely sort of improving me as a painter. I can feel it already. And I just hope you guys have enjoyed watching it. I hope that enthusiasm has come across. So if you fancy something a little different, little palette cleanser, I can highly recommend picking up one of these awesome lizard models. So as ever, if you've got any questions, pop them down in the comments. I will get back to you as soon as I'm able. If you've liked the video, hit the thumbs up, hit subscribe if you're not already. Take care, and I'll see you next time. If you've liked any of the models in this video and you fancy having an army of them yourself, but perhaps you don't have the time or wherewithal to get it done, consider dropping us an email at commissions@cultofpaint.com, and maybe Ben can sort you out.